Well, if landlords think they can get around this bill, I think they're wrong. We think that the measures in the bill are robust enough to be able to clamp down decisively on disreputable and, in some cases, criminal or rogue landlords.
Matthew Pennycook, Housing Minister. This week, the Renters' Rights Bill will make it back to Parliament and it will soon become law. For private renters, this has been years in the making. Why should they feel excited about your bill? What's different to the bill that the Conservatives had promised?
Well, it is a different bill, so it's not just a reheated renters reform bill. We've significantly overhauled major sections of it. So we've kept some of the sensible provisions that were in the previous government's legislation. For example, the fundamental reform of the tenancy regime. But we've made some significant changes, putting lots of new powers on the face of the bill. For example, new decent home standard, powers to end rental bidding. We've overhauled rent repayment orders, which are a way for tenants themselves to enforce against bad standards. So there's lots that's in the bill that's new. And we've made significant changes to deal with the various deficiencies, defects, omissions, and very crucially the loopholes that were in the previous legislation that we didn't think benefited tenants. We thought the previous government didn't have the balance right on those, so we've shut those down as well.
On bidding, I want to talk to you about this. So I was speaking to somebody last week. She's actually currently 8 months pregnant, and every time she goes to view a property, she is being asked to put in a bid against other people, some of whom are couples, so they've got two incomes. How are you going to make sure this practice of asking potential tenants to put in sealed bids is properly outlawed? How are you going to have oversight of that?
So there's powers in the bill to end rental bidding. This is a fairly new area of law, if you like, around the world. We've looked at examples of where action has been taken in Australia and New Zealand, and we've learnt from those models, and there are provisions in the bill to clamp down on that renting, because you're absolutely right. Landlords are often, particularly in very, if you like, hot rental markets, pitching renters against each other, playing them off to see who can bid up the highest amount of rent. We think that's wrong. The practice has got to end. The landlord should clearly state the amount of rent that they expect for the property, and if that rent is offered by a particular tenant, it should be accepted.
What about letting agents? Let's say I'm a letting agent, I make a call and say, well, this person's offered $1,500, but for $1,650 it's yours. Letting
agents is covered as well by the powers in the bill. They won't be able to engage in that sort of practice. So we've got to look at how the provisions are implemented, test that they work in practice. As I said, it's a fairly new area of law around the world, but we're determined to stamp out that practice. Tenants shouldn't be set against each other in that way, either by landlords or letting agents representing them.
And once the bill is law, if you're a renter and it still happens to you, because we have seen since the Tenant Fees Act, for instance, letting agents still doing things that they shouldn't do, if you find yourself in that situation, what can you do about it?
Well, there's a variety of provisions in the bill where we need to ensure that local authorities in particular are enforcing. There's action in many respects for courts, but you're absolutely right. We've got to look how it works in practice, make sure it is working. The intent, though, is very, very clear. We want to ban this practice for good. It's something that landlords and letting agents shouldn't be engaged in. And
when will Section 21, no-fault evictions, finally be banned? Do we have a concrete date?
We don't have a concrete date yet. We're not making a concrete date, partly because we want to ensure that when we announce a date, we're very clear that we can stick to it. But it's our intention, as you know, to get rid of Section 21 no-fault evictions, to overhaul the whole tenancy regime as quickly as possible after royal assent. My target, if I'm honest, is summer next year, but we have to see how quickly the bill progresses. But we want to get rid of it in short order, because we are not going to do what the previous government suggested, which is tie reform of the private rented sector to a sort of subjective assessment of when the courts are ready, on metrics that were never made public actually, but when the courts are ready for the new regime to be brought into place. We do need to see court improvements. That's absolutely right. We recognise the concerns about significant pressure on the tribunal, on the court system. I think some of that is overdone, if I'm honest. We're not going to get a straight read across from every Section 21 eviction to a Section 8 possession order, but there might be challenges. We've got to work with colleagues in the Ministry of Justice to ensure the courts are ready, but we're not going to make tenancy reform contingent upon them.
But landlords will still be able to get their properties back under certain circumstances. What are those?
So there are a number of new mandatory possession grounds. We think it's right that landlords have them. If they genuinely want to take back their property to sell, if they want to take back the property to live in themselves or to have a family member live in, there are certain mandatory grounds that we're introducing. We think it's right that they take them back in those circumstances, and that those possession grounds not be discriminatory. Landlords need to be able to rely on those robust grounds in appropriate circumstances. Similarly, if they've got a tenant causing antisocial behaviour or other reasonable reasons to evict a tenant. What we are not going to do, though, is allow those new possession grounds to potentially be abused. So we have really, in the bill, tried to overhaul the ways in which those grounds could be abused and to close those loopholes. So let me give you an example. In the previous legislation, when a landlord took back their property on one of these grounds, either to sell or to move back in, they could re-let that property after 3 months. Now, void periods in lots of parts of the country we're seeing are quite high. Landlords can easily, in many cases, in particular in those hot rental markets, put up with an empty property for 2 or 3 months. If they can immediately evict someone to say they're going to sell the property, then not sell it, re-let within 3 months, we think that's potential area of abuse. So we've increased that 3-month period to 12 months. So what we want to see by the changes we've made is those grounds, we know, when they are used, they are being used for genuine reasons rather than as a means to evict people by the back door.
But what will happen to landlords who do abuse the bill and let out the property anyway? So let's say I evict my tenant, I say I'm going to move in myself, and then I re-let the property out, and that tenant spots that I've done it. Who can they call, and what will happen to the landlord?
Well, all of the measures in the bill, including when you can rent and when you can come to a tenancy agreement with a tenant, if you like, are regulated by the new system. So I think your challenge is, and it's a fair one, if a landlord decides to operate completely outside of the legal regime, there are ways that they can be got at, if you like. The serving of a notice won't be valid in law if they move outside of the system. So under the system, they have to issue the proper guidance, be registered to the portal. All of these boxes they've got to tick to be able to operate lawfully. There will be, as you know, unscrupulous landlords who try to operate out of that system through the courts, through local authority enforcement, new investigatory powers we're giving in the bill. We think we can clamp down on those. But you're absolutely right. I think, again, the challenge is we want through this bill to stamp out rogue practices like that. Will the bill do it? Will the bill do it? We're confident it will. Of course, got to test how it works in practice going forward.
What would you say to landlords who think that they can get around it? Because we do know that there are some landlords who, as things stand, don't think the existing legislation applies to them.
Well, if landlords think they can get around this bill, I think they're wrong. We think that the measures in the bill are robust enough to be able to clamp down decisively on disreputable and, in some cases, criminal or rogue landlords. If they think they can get around the bill, they're wrong. Let's test out in the course of the passage of the bill whether we've got the balance right in being able to clamp down on them. We think, as I say, through the powers in particular we're giving to local authorities in terms of what they're able to investigate, what they're able to fine landlords for, and we've increased fines in the bill for civil penalties, £7,000, in some cases £40,000 for more serious offences. We think those are robust enough powers that landlords should feel that they can't move around the system if they're tempted to do so. I should say, because we're talking about landlords all in the negative sense, we know there are very good landlords out there, and most of them do right by their tenants. Those landlords have nothing to worry about from this bill. As I say, we've tried to amend the previous legislation, which we didn't think got the balance right. We think this does strike the right balance. It delivers for tenants, but it also delivers for landlords who, in the main, want tenants in place for long periods of time, stable, good tenants paying rent, and they want their properties to be up to the right standards and to be treating those tenants fairly in terms of not threatening them with unfair, unjustified threat of eviction, if you like, if they complain or whatever other action that a tenant might feel is required to be taken.
One of the big problems that I'm hearing from private renters day in, day out at the moment is the cost of renting. We know that private rents are still rising beyond inflation at around 8% nationally. That is a huge amount for people to see their rent go up by. Yep. Is there anything in this massive piece of legislation that's going to help people with the cost of renting? Well,
I think there is measures in the bill that will help with the cost of renting. particularly in terms of how rent increases can take place. So in a change to the current system, landlords will only be able to increase the rent once a year. They will only be able to increase it by a reasonable amount. Where a tenant doesn't feel a rent increase is reasonable, they can take the matter to the tribunal, and the tribunal will adjudicate on whether the rent increase is reasonable or not for that particular market area. We've again made a change to the previous legislation. The tribunal can't award a rent that's higher than the landlord's asked for, and we've put in place measures to ensure that where an unreasonable rent rise has been requested and a tenant has gone to the tribunal, tenants can't be hit by the potential arrears that might result if a tribunal makes an award, because we think that's would be potentially a serious deterrent to tenants taking cases to tribunal. And just to be very clear, at the moment, very, very small numbers of tenants go to tribunal. We want more to go to tribunal. We don't want to overload the tribunal, but we want more tenants to take challenges against unreasonable rent increases to tribunal, because the tribunal has got, if you like, a sort of public interest role in benchmarking rents in particular areas. But we think those are robust enough provisions that will ensure tenants aren't, if you like, evicted just by rent hikes, which is one of the potential areas that in the last bill we were worried about could effectively mean Section 21 by the back door.
What do you say to landlords who say, well, I might not be able to meet my costs if I can't put rent up by 40%?
Well, I think it'll be for the tribunal ultimately to judge whether an increase of that magnitude was reasonable for the given market areas. I think that sort of order of rent increase shouldn't be what's taking place. What we want overall is a system that's more stable, more predictable. Yes, landlords should be able to increase rents in any given area by the market rate of that area, but particularly when they're hiking rents. And hiking rents, the worry is, when a tenant might complain about damp or mould or a hazard, the possibility that landlords use a rent hike as a means of effectively, once Section 21 no-fault evictions are abolished, of removing tenants that they want rid of. That's what we've got to clamp down on.
And one of the other things in this bill is to ensure that people aren't discriminated against when they're renting. So that's already supposed to happen, but it doesn't often.
Yep.
We know that people who rely on state support to pay their rent are often discriminated against. This bill will strengthen anti-discrimination legislation.
Yep.
But one woman I was speaking to last week, who I mentioned her earlier, is pregnant at the moment. Letting agents are turning her away from queues to view properties as soon as they see her bump.
Yep.
How do we stop that happening?
It's completely unacceptable, and what we want to do via this bill is to ban rental discrimination, both against renters with children, families, but also those who are in receipt of benefits of any kind. You're right to say that those practices, in theory, are already illegal. In practice, we know that they occur. What we're trying to do through this bill is to strengthen, as you say, those provisions to clamp down on this, both over abuse in terms of discrimination through, for example, adverts that say, and I've come across these myself as a constituency MP, no people on benefits can bother applying, but also that intentional discrimination that can take place in person, even where it's not advertised when a tenant views a property. We've got to do that through the bill. What we've chosen to go down is a sort of civil route, if you like. We want the barrier for local authorities to bring these cases to be low. We want them to be able to fine landlords and letting agents that engage in these sorts of practices. We think that will act as a deterrent. Our clear messages through the legislation: these practices are unacceptable. They've got to be got rid of. Again, we'll see how the implementation works out on the ground and whether it is enough. It's an area I want to keep closely under review, because we're absolutely determined to outlaw these practices for good.
This week, a major piece of legislation will make it back into Parliament, and this is a huge shake-up of a massive part of people's lives: housing, where they live, how much it costs, and how secure it is. But other stories are dominating the news, one in particular focusing on a friend of yours who wrote a report about VAT on private schools. Do you accept that report can't be considered independent because the author is friendly with a Labour minister?
I find that notion laughable, if I'm honest. The idea that the Institute for Fiscal Studies has compromised its objectivity, its independence, because someone I happen to know from many years ago did their job and wrote a report. I think it's ludicrous, if I'm honest.